The Chicago Bears need this year's draft class to be the long-term foundation for the franchise. But that doesn't mean every pick needs to be a home run in order to call this draft a success.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook, join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk, and make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We appreciate all of our everydayers that tune in 5 days a week. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who can take you on the journey of self-discovery from wherever you are. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. On the show today, we look at what this draft class has to do in order to be a success for the Chicago Bears, what the expectations should be, more so long-term over short-term, how important it is for this draft class to be good, and what that looks like, both from the big picture, what they need to get out of the whole class, and then we'll go individually through each of the picks, or at least the main picks in this draft class to say, okay, what does it look like if Darnell Wright, what does he have to do in order to be a successful pick for the Chicago Bears? How does he get there, and how might he not get there? What is sort of the range of outcomes there, and how does he get to this point of successful first-round pick for Ryan Poles? Same thing for Gervon Dexter and Tyrique Stevenson and Zach Pickens, and get a better sense of like how we should be watching this draft class based on proper expectations moving forward. I think big picture, when you have 4 picks in the top 64 of any draft class, but as the Bears did in this draft, you need those players to become starters. I think an A-plus draft is all 4 of those players being long-term starters for your franchise. The draft can still be a success if, say, maybe one of them doesn't end up really being the kind of long-term starter that you hope. Certainly, if anybody busts out completely, that really makes it hard to call it a super successful draft class. But if Darnell Wright is great and the defensive linemen are great, and say Stevenson doesn't work out, or one of the 2 defensive linemen doesn't work out that well, but the other one's pretty good and Stevenson's pretty good and Wright's great, like that still feels to me like a successful draft class, right? It doesn't have to be that all 4 of those guys become Pro Bowlers in order to say, okay, Ryan Poles, good job, you checked the box when we look back in the future on this 2023 draft class. As for the later round guys, certainly you can't expect 4th, 5th, and 7th round picks to become even NFL starters. Like, I think it's too high of an expectation to think that those guys will become starters. You hope that they become starters. It's certainly a success if they become starters, but they can still be successful draft picks even if they never become starters. And we'll get into some of the specifics there. But, if Tyler Scott, the receiver, never becomes like a true number 1 outside receiver, or if Roshan Johnson, the running back, never becomes a true lead workhorse running back in the NFL, those won't make them failures of draft picks. It's a reflection of ultimately where they're drafted, especially as you get later and later in the draft. A lot of that production or anything you get from them ends up becoming a little bit more of a bonus in that regard. If Noah Sewell becomes a starter, great, but is that really the expectation for a 5th round linebacker to eventually become a starter? Expectation, no. Hope, yes. Same with Terrell Smith, the cornerback from Minnesota. Like, you hope. You draft him because you think he can become a starter. And certainly, if those types of players, your 4th, 5th, and 7th round picks, become starters and can be outplaying their own draft position, that can help you then maybe overcome earlier draft picks that maybe don't pan out as well. Like we were saying, like if one of the defensive tackles or whatever, to pick a player, doesn't pan out, but Terrell Smith, your 5th round cornerback, becomes a starter in the NFL. Like all of a sudden, the draft class can still be a big success if some of the later picks end up outperforming some of the earlier picks. Like for me, it's about holistically what you get from the draft class first and foremost, not exactly where they come from. Like each individual pick has success and failure, I don't want to say metrics, but criteria, I think, that they need to reach. And certainly the expectations and the criteria is higher for the earlier picks than it is for the later picks. But when you talk about the draft class as a whole, the 9 selections I think the Bears made this year, you just have to get a certain amount of production, a certain amount of talent, a certain amount of quality out of that group. And when you're talking about building the foundation of the Bears franchise, it matters a little bit less than which round they were actually drafted in. And it just matters, do you actually get enough good players and good talent from this draft class? Like ideally, and I don't know that there's a hard and fast number that it's a success if you have 3 starters and it's a failure if you have 2, or it's just, if it's a success if you have 4 starters and it's a failure if you have 3. Not exactly. The measurement is not starters versus non-starters, but it's about having, 2, 3, 4 starters out of this type of a draft class with this much depth and this much early draft capital invested, and having most of the rest of the guys be quality backups that maybe aren't going to become, again, big time starters, but if you have to have them fill in a pinch, they can be valuable there. They can also be big time contributors on special teams and give you that roster that when you look 3, 4, 5, 6 years from now at this Bears roster, how much of it is, quote unquote, homegrown talent, even the backups, not just the starters, but the depth on your roster. How many of them are guys that you drafted, you developed, you've had cost control over for a number of years, and you know them through and through, how they're going to fit your roster and your system. That's what the Bears need first and foremost from this draft class, is guys that are going to fill those spots and give you more of that long-term homegrown talent over time that's cheaper than signing free agents, less risky than signing free agents because you know what they are. They're locked in on rookie deals, and they give you guys that you know and you can trust all up and down your depth chart, in addition to needing some of them to be starters at the top and needing them to not, bust out and flame out altogether. That's, I think, how you look at it from the draft class as a whole. But I want to go more specifically on each individual pick and look at what does each player have to do for their draft choice to be a success for the Chicago Bears next on Locked On Bears. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp provides therapy online. It's a great way to get started if you've never done online therapy before. I do online therapy every single week, and it's a really important part of my own personal mental health regimen. I think of doing therapy as like going to the gym for my brain. I don't go to the gym because my body is broken and needs to be fixed, but I go to the gym so my body can be at its best. And I think of my therapy sessions as exactly the same way. It helps me be as mentally fit as possible, just like going to the gym is about being physically fit. And BetterHelp is a great way to get started. It's entirely online. It's convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. You just fill out a questionnaire and they'll match you with a licensed therapist. But if your first one's just not the right fit for you, you can switch them at any time for no additional charge. Find more balance with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Darnell Wright is the most important pick in this draft that the Chicago Bears need to be correct on, both because he was the first pick and a top 10 pick, but also the position he is and his direct impact then on Justin Fields. They are relying on Darnell Wright to solidify the offensive line and put Justin Fields then in the best position to be successful. And they need him to step in and be that guy. And when we start to talk about a successful draft pick, like use of the top 10 pick, to me, it's never going to be fair to compare exactly Darnell Wright to Jalen Carter, for example. A lot of Bears fans wanted Jalen Carter at 9. The Bears traded to 10. Take Wright instead. It's not even necessarily perfectly fair to compare Darnell Wright to Broderick Jones, the offensive tackle taken by the Pittsburgh Steelers, or even like Peter Skoronski. Paris Johnson was taken before Darnell Wright, so it's not really a fair comparison either because the Bears never had a chance to take Paris Johnson. But Darnell Wright is in his own unique set of circumstances in Chicago that are different than the circumstances Jalen Carter it will be in Philadelphia, that are different than the circumstances Broderick Jones will be in Pittsburgh, and the Titans took Peter Skoronski and may end up playing him at guard anyway. But Darnell Wright, as a top 10 pick, in order for that to be a successful pick, needs to be essentially like a 10-year starter for the Chicago Bears, a player who starts from week one as the Bears, presumably right tackle, but less important what position, but a starter from week one, starts throughout his entire rookie contract and signs a second long-term contract with the Chicago Bears and remains a starter over that span. The exact number, 10 years is kind of the round number that people throw out. Oh, he's a 10-year starter in the NFL. He's a 15-year starter. The exact number is not as important to me as starts his entire rookie contract and plays through a second contract. I suppose the second contract doesn't have to be the Chicago Bears for him to still be a successful player in the NFL, but to be a worthwhile pick, the Bears need to make sure that second contract is with them, right? You could see a Mike McGlinchey situation where Wright gets through the end of his rookie contract, hits free agency, and another team pays him more than the Bears were willing to pay him. Would that make him an unsuccessful pick by the Chicago Bears? I don't think so, but certainly you would like to get a second contract out of your top 10 pick in order to feel like you really got the most value out of that pick. But I think that's the kind of thing it has to look like for Wright. I don't think Darnell Wright needs to be a Pro Bowl player, for example. I don't think he needs to make any Pro Bowls to still be a quality player, or a quality pick. Because I think baked into this idea that he's a 5-year starter in Chicago plus a second contract is therefore that he's good enough to do so. That he is playing at a performance well enough that justifies him being that starter. To be a consistent enough starting right tackle to get a second contract and remain the starter on that second contract sort of encapsulates to me what he needs to be able to do as a top 10 pick to say, yep, successful pick for the Chicago Bears. If he flames out and becomes a backup, if he gets through his rookie contract, but you're just not really sure if he's a long-term guy at offensive tackle because there's just questions about him, to me, that ends up being a disappointing top 10 pick. Like, you have to be a surefire starter as a top 10 pick in the NFL to be really, really worth that pick. Certainly there's a middle ground between complete bust, where he's out of the league, or just a total backup, and being the 10-year starter. There's a middle ground here where he's okay, but not great. But to be that success threshold, that sort of like pass fail as a top 10 pick, to me, it's about how long he is a starter for your Chicago Bears, because that's what's so important to get out of a top 10 pick. He needs to be that critical player in your offense that you're getting a long-term investment that's really, really crucial to your offensive success and makes it worth having invested such a high pick in a position to make sure that's just shored up, locked down, you're good to go. You don't have to worry about the right tackle position for the next decade, give or take a few years on either end of that. It's a little bit messier when you get to the second round and some of the later rounds after that. I mean, especially at a position like defensive tackle where, you have two guys drafted there that it's not as though they're competing with each other per se, but right, that their opportunities are not going to be totally equal despite being drafted, 8 picks apart? 53 to 64 would be 11 picks apart. I guess I forgot. 61 would have been 8 picks there. But anyway, drafted very close, similar expectations, right? As second round picks, you do want those guys to be starters as well. Like, second round picks should come in and establish themselves as players that are starters. Not necessarily as a rookie. I certainly think we know that there's a developmental curve with these two guys, but they do need to be players that start on your defensive line. And starting at the defensive line is not necessarily plays every single snap, right? The Bears are going to rotate their defensive tackles even when these guys are 3-4 years in their career. No defensive tackle is playing every snap in the NFL. Not even defensive ends are playing every snap in the NFL. But to be successful, you have to feel like, okay, Pickens is our number 1 3 technique. Dexter is our number 1 nose tackle, or however they want to end up rotating these guys in there. But like that, these guys are not players you're constantly looking to upgrade. It's like, you don't want them to be like, like Justin Jones this past season. He was okay. We went into this offseason thinking, yeah, the Bears should probably do better at that position, but you can get by with him there. Like, you'd like a little bit better than that from Pickens and Dexter to be guys that you feel like, okay, you still need good depth behind them because you're going to rotate guys around in there, but we feel pretty good about them as the starters, and let's just bolster our defensive line to get some depth there. I don't think you need those guys to be 10-sack guys. They don't need to be Fletcher Cox. They don't need to be Aaron Donald. They certainly don't need to be Pro Bowl caliber players like that. Like, they don't need to be absolute game changer, game breakers, but they need to be guys who can start, who can be number 1 options at their defensive line positions, and can give you flashes and plays and hold up and not be sitting there thinking like, man, get this guy out of here. We're tired of him and he's never any good. Right? They need to develop and get to that space. You can see where a failure happens if, they're always just rotational guys off the bench. I think that's a disappointment for second round picks. If you're drafting guys, even late second round, if they're just always going to be, that number 3 defensive tackle rotating in, but you always have like 2 starters ahead of them on the depth chart, that you want more out of even the 53rd and 64th picks in the draft. Like you want a little bit more out of those kind of guys when you're going to draft them that high. You want to feel like you've got solid, reliable players in there, even if they're not absolute game changers or game breakers. As you get later in the draft, you temper those expectations a little bit more. And I don't want to forget about Tyrique Stevenson here either, but we'll look at where we can properly set expectations for guys we're actually really excited about. A lot of these day 3 draft picks next on Locked On Bears. As a second round pick, Tyrique Stevenson also needs to be a starter. One of your top 3 cornerbacks. Again, not necessarily this year as a rookie. I'm willing to say with second round picks, like second round picks do not have to come in and instantly be a starter, the best player at their position universally. I think given where the depth chart is right now at cornerback, Stevenson probably should. Right, you look at the defensive line and you got veterans in there like Andrew Billings and Justin Jones. They're not great, but you feel like, Dexter and Pickens are a little more developmental, and you got a couple veterans that can be the quote-unquote starters, but all 4 are going to play a lot, and that's fine. You look at corner, and the main thing standing in Stevenson's way from being a starter is Kindle Vildor. It's Vildor and then the other rookie, Terrell Smith, or the undrafted free agent last year, Jalen Jones. But to me, that does not represent significant huge obstacle that we shouldn't expect Stevenson to beat. It's going to be a competition, and there's a chance Kindle Vildor improves even more and takes that job, or if Jalen Jones takes a big second-year leap, or that Terrell Smith is a very good rookie right out of the gate and could potentially compete for that spot. But it feels like the favorite right now should be Tyrique Stevenson coming in as a rookie, they trade up to 58, was it, to take him in the second round. Like he's not a failure of a draft pick and a disappointment right away if he's not your week 1 starter as that number 3 cornerback on the outside, but it does feel like that's where he should get to. I don't know that in order to be like a successful draft pick, he certainly never has to be a true number 1 corner, right? He does not need to be the lockdown one-on-one guy who you feel like is just your go-to corner that you match up with any number 1 receiver. No. He does not, in order to be a successful draft pick, he does not need to do so. You'd hope that he could. I mean, that's what you hope for you hope all your cornerbacks can develop into that, but realistically, very few ultimately do, and very few that make it to the second round ultimately do. But to be able to hold down that kind of spot, again, you want him to be a guy that you don't go into the offseason thinking you need to upgrade all the time or wishing that the Bears could upgrade all the time. Like, that's what Kindle Vildor is right now, right? Vildor's a guy who we go into this offseason saying, you know what? If the Bears had to use him again as their number 3 cornerback, okay. It's not ideal. He's not great, but if you upgrade everything else, you can maybe get by with him and hope that he keeps getting better. Like, you can't have that be your second round pick, Tyrique Stevenson. That's great for a 5th round pick in Kindle Vildor, and that's where I'll rope in Terrell Smith, the Minnesota cornerback. Like, if Terrell Smith could get to that point where he's competing to start, like, that's a successful 5th round pick. Terrell Smith and Noah Sewell, I think, are in a similar conversation in the 5th round where it's like, if those guys become starters, that's a bonus. It should be viewed as a bonus if those guys become starters. At a minimum, you want them to be 4-year players on your team as core special teams players who maybe fill in a pinch in the starting lineup when you have injuries or whatever, or rotate in packages where you have extra either linebackers or cornerbacks on the field respectively, and you feel like, okay, they can fill in here and there, but you don't have to trust them as an every down starter to still be a successful 5th round pick. Like, be a reliable backup who's good on special teams. That's a good success for me with the 5th round guys. If you want to throw in the 7th round guys, the defensive lineman Travis Bell and the safety Kendall Williamson, like, if those guys can make the 53-man roster every year and play on special teams, that's a win for a 7th round pick for me. Anything beyond that is a bonus. Just making the roster and making the field on some special teams plays, like, that's absolutely a win through and through. Don't want to skip over the 2 4th rounders. I mean, I have so far, but don't want to forget about them. Roshan Johnson, the running back, and Tyler Scott, the wide receiver. This one, fourth round's that tricky range where, again, I don't think you expect your fourth rounder to become a long-term starter for your team. But you do, I guess, expect versus hope your fourth round picks become long-term contributors for your team. Does that make sense? Like, they don't have to be starters in order to be successful. But they can't just be backups who never play, or else you'd feel like, man, kind of wish you could have got a little more out of that spot there. Like, to me, if Roshan Johnson's always he needs to be a number 2 / maybe number 3 running back, but at least a number 3 running back, probably number 2, who rotates in and gets some plays and plays a bunch of special teams and gets some snaps on offense and gets some carries here and there and runs well, but he certainly does not have to be the number 1 running back. He has the potential to develop into that, and I think he may very well do so by as early as next year, but he doesn't have to be. He can just be a very good backup running back, a great number 2 or even a high-end number 3 who gets in the rotation, not just a 3 who sits on the bench and plays special teams. He's got to be a part of the offense, but doesn't need to be a big part of the offense. Similar for Tyler Scott at wide receiver. He doesn't, to be a successful fourth-round pick, you don't have to become a number 1 receiver. I don't think you have to become a number 2 receiver either to be a successful fourth-round pick. You hope you can, but really, to be a consistent number 3 and number 4 in the NFL and last in the league a while where you're not going to play every snap, but you're going to have some deep plays in here, and you're a fill-in guy who can make some plays here and there, but maybe you don't have to be consistent enough to become a number 2 and number 1. Maybe your skill set ends up a little bit more siloed in certain roles that you just do really, really well. That's a successful fourth-round pick at wide receiver. He never has to be a 1,000-yard guy in order to be a success, but you'd like him to be a 400 to 600-yard guy every year kind of thing, right? Third, fourth in your team in receiving yards type of role in the offense. That should be the expectations for successful fourth round wide receiver draft pick. Same thing with Roshan Johnson's rushing yards, right? 400 to 600 yards as a backup running back kind of thing. Again, not firm numbers there, but around that type of range where, no, he's not your leading rusher, and maybe he's not even your second leading rusher when you have a quarterback like Justin Fields, but he's contributing to your running game, he's contributing to your passing game, and he's contributing to your special teams. That's the kind of thing you look for. Fourth round picks need to contribute. They don't have to start. Fifth round picks need to be good depth. They don't have to be great contributors, but they do need to be good depth. And seventh round picks, if they can contribute at all, that's a success. If they can be good depth at all, that's absolutely a success. Whereas your first round pick needs to be a long-term starter. Your second round picks ideally need to be starters in some capacity, or at least some kind of major contributor that is a starter or kind of in a starting rotation on your team. That's how I view the expectations for this Chicago Bears draft class to be a success. I would love to hear what you think this draft class needs to do. Let us know in the comments here on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel. You can tweet us at Locked On Bears. You can post in the Locked On Bears Facebook group to keep the conversation going there as well. However you do it, just make sure you're subscribed to Locked On Bears on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. It's free. It's available on all platforms. There's no excuse not to keep making Locked On Bears your first listen every single day. Become an everydayer. I love hearing from all of you who put in the comments or in the Facebook group that you're an everyday listener and everydayer here on the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your team every day. And tomorrow, we're going to be Locked On Ducks with our friends from Locked On Ducks to try and get a better sense of what Noah Sewell could bring to the Chicago Bears. Spencer McLaughlin is the host over there. He's great. And we're going to kind of get a sense of what Sewell was able to do at Oregon and how that's going to translate to the NFL, and maybe how that family lineage of the Sewell family may or may not help Noah in his transfer to Chicago. So be on the lookout for that. I believe we're going to talk to Locked On Longhorns for the Friday podcast this week. We're still pinning down a time, but I think that's going to be the case to talk about Roshan Johnson. We're still going to circle back to Locked On Gamecocks and Zach Pickens at some point here too. It's just been scheduling, trying to get all these Locked On podcast hosts from our college shows on Locked On Bears, trying to find slots for everybody with their schedules and stuff. We're getting through it one draft pick at a time. So come on back for more Bears draft pick analysis. Go back and watch our interviews with Locked On Tennessee Volunteers about Darnell Wright, Locked On Florida about Gervon Dexter, and we did Locked On Canes, Miami Hurricanes, for Tyrique Stevenson as well. Really getting you our local experts on each of the Chicago Bears draft picks. And of course, then you have to come back tomorrow and every day for your next opportunity to bear down.